The Greyhound bus released a long, tired hiss, its brakes groaning as it settled into its bay at the downtown Los Angeles terminal. For Carlos, the sound was a symphony of arrival, the final note of a journey that had consumed all his savings and every ounce of his courage. He stepped off the bus and into a wall of sound and smell, the sharp tang of exhaust fumes mingling with the greasy, inviting aroma of street vendors frying onions and peppers. The air, cooler than he expected, carried a chaotic blend of English and Spanish, a fast-paced, overlapping dialogue that made his head spin. He clutched the strap of his worn backpack, the only possession he had in the world besides the clothes on his back and the crumpled piece of paper in his pocket. On it, written in his mother's careful script, was the phone number for his cousin Javier. Javier, who had promised him everything: a room in his apartment, a job on his construction crew, a foothold in the land of opportunity. A wide, nervous smile stretched across Carlos's face. He was finally here. Finding a hard plastic bench, he pulled out his cheap, prepaid phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he dialed the number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, before clicking over to a generic voicemail. "He's probably just stuck in traffic," Carlos muttered to himself, his Spanish a soft whisper against the terminal's noise. He'd heard stories about LA's infamous traffic. He sent a quick text: "Javier, soy yo, Carlos. Ye llegué a la terminal. Avísame." An hour crawled by. The initial thrill of arrival began to curdle into a low-grade anxiety. Families reunited with tearful hugs, travelers scurried towards connecting buses, but Carlos remained on his bench, a solitary statue in the river of humanity. He tried calling again. This time, it went straight to voicemail. His heart hammered against his ribs. He checked the number on the paper, comparing it digit by digit to the one on his screen. It was correct. As the sun dipped below the towering skyscrapers, casting long, ominous shadows across the city, the terminal began to empty. The vibrant energy bled away, replaced by the sterile hum of fluorescent lights on a grimy floor. A janitor pushed a wide broom nearby, pointedly ignoring him. Carlos's phone battery was dying, the little red icon blinking like a warning light. He dialed one last time, a prayer on his lips. An automated voice, cold and metallic, delivered the verdict: "The number you have dialed has been disconnected." The words didn't register at first. He listened again, the English sentence replaying in his mind until its meaning crashed through his disbelief. Disconnected. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't bad reception. It was a deliberate severing. The promise that had pulled him across a border that had been his North Star for months had vanished into thin air. Javier was not coming. A heavy-set security guard approached, his keys jangling at his hip. "Terminal's closing, man." "Gotta clear out." Carlos nodded numbly, shouldering his backpack. It felt impossibly heavy now, weighted down not by his meager belongings, but by the crushing reality of his situation. He stepped outside into the night. The city was a roaring beast of headlights and sirens. He had never felt so small, so utterly and profoundly alone. He walked without direction, his boots echoing on the pavement, until he found a dark alley between a laundromat and a boarded-up shop. He sank to the cold concrete, pulling his thin jacket tight, the promise of America replaced by the bitter, metallic taste of fear. The first light of dawn was a cruel gray smear across the Los Angeles sky, filtering into the alley and illuminating the grime on the brick walls that had been Carlos's sanctuary. A bone-deep chill had settled into him, a damp cold that his thin jacket couldn't repel. His stomach twisted into a painful knot, a raw, gnawing hunger that was more immediate and terrifying than the loneliness. He pushed himself up, his muscles aching from the hard ground, and the first thought that consumed him was water. His throat was sandpaper. He stumbled out of the alley, blinking against the nascent city light. The streets, which had seemed so menacingly empty last night, were now beginning to thrum with life. Cars hissed by, their headlights still on, and the occasional city bus rumbled past like a mechanical beast. He saw a small park across a wide boulevard, a patch of green amidst the concrete, and a flicker of hope ignited within him. A public park meant a drinking fountain. He waited for a break in the traffic, his heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and desperation, and darted across the street. The water from the fountain was metallic and icy, but it was the most wonderful thing he had ever tasted. He drank until his stomach sloshed, then splashed the cold water on his face, trying to wash away the despair that clung to him like the city's smog. The immediate crisis of thirst was solved, but the hunger remained, a persistent, dull ache. He had a few dollars left, crumpled bills he had guarded jealously through the night. Not enough for a real meal, but maybe something. As he wandered, aimlessly at first, he remembered conversations from his village. Men who had gone north spoke of Las Espinas, the corners where contractors came in pickups to hire laborers for the day. It was a gamble, they said, but it was a chance. Following the flow of other men who looked as worn and hopeful as he felt, he found it. A corner by a hardware store, already crowded with 24 men. They were a mix of ages and nationalities, but they shared a common language of need. They stood in small, tense groups, their eyes fixed on the road, scanning every approaching truck. Carlos felt a surge of intimidation. These men were leaner, harder, their gazes sharpened by routine. He was fresh meat. For an hour, he stood on the periphery, watching as pickups and vans pulled up. Each arrival sparked a frenzy, a desperate surge as men swarmed the vehicles, shouting, pleading, advertising their skills. Plamiria, Pinchera, Trabajo Duro. Carlos, shy and unsure, was always too slow, too far back. Finally, a battered Ford F-150 pulled over, and a burly man with a sunburned neck leaned out. Need 3, demo work, 10 an hour. He pointed randomly into the crowd. You, and you. His finger landed on Carlos. A jolt of adrenaline shot through him. He scrambled into the back of the truck with 2 other men, the cold metal rattling against his bones as they sped off. The job was brutal. They were gutting a fire-damaged house in a quiet suburb, a world away from the corner. The air was thick with soot and the acrid smell of burnt wood. He spent 10 hours hauling charred debris, his hands quickly blistering, his back screaming in protest. The contractor barked orders, offering no water and no breaks. At the end of the day, exhausted and covered in filth, Carlos lined up for his pay. The contractor peeled bills from a thick wad. He handed the other men their money, then turned to Carlos. He counted out $80 and shoved them into his hand. That's it, but you said 10 hours. 10 an hour, Carlos said, his voice barely a whisper. The man just laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. You got a problem with it. Take it or leave it, amigo. He climbed into his truck and drove away, leaving Carlos standing on the curb, the $80 feeling like an insult in his blistered palm. He had been cheated, but he was powerless. The profound injustice burned hotter than his aching muscles. That night, he bought a hot dog and a soda from a street vendor and ate it on a bus bench, the city's glittering lights marking his profound, crushing solitude. The $80 felt like a lead weight in Carlos's pocket, both a meager lifeline and a bitter reminder of his own powerlessness. The morning sun cast long, cool shadows across the East LA streets, but he felt no warmth. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest from the previous day's labor, a deep, aching soreness that was more than just physical. The thought of returning to the day labor corner, of facing those predatory eyes and bargaining for his dignity, was unbearable. He couldn't do it, not again. Hunger, however, was a more persistent and less negotiable master. He spent a few precious dollars on a stale pastry and a cup of coffee from a corner store, eating slowly on a bus bench, watching the city wake up around him. He felt invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of other people's busy lives. He knew he needed a plan, a real one, not just a desperate gamble for a day's wages. But what? His mind was a blank wall of anxiety. He wandered aimlessly for hours, the vastness of the city pressing in on him, each street corner a potential dead end. As the sun climbed higher, he found himself near a small park. Exhausted, he sat on the grass, his back against a tree. He was about to close his eyes when a snippet of conversation in Spanish drifted over to him. Two older men, their faces weathered by sun and time, were sharing a bag of oranges. "A stew at St. Michael's was good yesterday," one said. "Better than Tuesdays. At least there they treat you like a person." The other man nodded. "Is verdad. A hot meal and a kind word. It's more than you can ask for most days." They mentioned a street name just a few blocks away, St. Michael's, a church. The words echoed in Carlos's mind. His first instinct was suspicion. Was anything truly free? Was it another trap, another way to be exploited? Yet the weariness in the men's voices sounded genuine, not like a sales pitch. Desperation warred with his newfound cynicism. He got to his feet, the address repeating in his head like a mantra. He walked slowly, hesitantly, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a fragile, unfamiliar flicker of hope. He found the church, a modest brick building with a simple wooden cross. A small, hand-painted sign in Spanish and English pointed to a side door. Community, lunch 12 p.m. People were already trickling in, families with small children, elderly individuals, and young men like himself, all with the same look of quiet need in their eyes. It was different from the day labor corner. There was no shouting, no posturing, just a shared, unspoken understanding. He watched for a full 10 minutes before his empty stomach finally won the battle, and he shuffled into the line. Inside, the smell of simmering beef and vegetables filled a large, humble hall. The clatter of cutlery and murmured conversations created a comforting hum. When Carlos reached the front, an older woman with kind eyes and a warm, wrinkled smile stood behind the counter. "Hola, mijo," she said gently, her voice like a balm on his frayed nerves. "Looks like you could use a full plate." She didn't ask where he was from or what his story was. She just saw his hunger. She ladled a generous portion of stew into a bowl, adding a thick slice of bread on the side. "Find a seat anywhere. God bless you." The simple, unconditional kindness was so unexpected, it almost brought him to tears. He found an empty spot at a long table and took his first bite. The stew was hot, rich, and more nourishing than anything he'd eaten in weeks. It was more than food, it was a moment of grace. It was proof that amidst the cruelty and indifference, goodness still existed. It was a single, steady light in his suffocating darkness. St. Michael's became Carlos's anchor. The daily walk to the church carved a path of purpose into his otherwise aimless days. The initial fear that had coiled in his stomach on his first visit was replaced by a quiet sense of belonging. He was no longer just a shadow seeking a meal. He was a familiar face in a sea of them. He learned to recognize the tired lines on the faces of the other men, the quiet resilience in the eyes of the women, each person carrying a story as heavy as his own. He would sit in the same corner of the hall, the warm plate of food not just nourishing his body, but soothing the raw edges of his solitude. After a week, the act of simply receiving felt insufficient. He watched Elena, the woman whose simple kindness had been his first lifeline, moving through the kitchen with a grace that defied her age. One afternoon, he saw her struggle to lift a large, steaming pot of stew onto the serving line. Without a second thought, Carlos stood up, walked into the kitchen, and gently took the handles from her. "Déjeme ayudar, señora," he said softly. Elena looked up, surprised, then a warm, crinkling smile spread across her face. "Gracias, amigo, you have strong arms." From that day on, Carlos had a new role. He arrived early and stayed late, washing mountains of dishes, mopping the floors, and chopping endless piles of onions and carrots. The work was menial, but it filled him with a profound sense of dignity. He was contributing, earning his meal not with money, but with effort. He was part of the machinery of kindness, no longer just a beneficiary of it. Working in the kitchen gave him a new perspective. It was the nerve center of the community, a place where conversations flowed as freely as the coffee. He heard everything. He heard a man named Miguel lamenting how a painting contractor on Figueroa had shorted him 2 days' pay. An hour later, he heard one of the church volunteers mention that her brother-in-law, a decent man who ran a small construction firm, was desperate for reliable painters. Carlos's mind raced. He looked around the hall for Miguel, but the man had already eaten and disappeared back into the city's anonymity. The missed connection gnawed at him. It was a simple, solvable problem, but the lines of communication were broken, lost in the chaotic shuffle of survival. He felt a pang of frustration, a sense of helplessness that reminded him of his first days in the city. He could have helped. That small piece of information could have changed Miguel's week, maybe even his month. That evening, walking back to the sheltered alley he still called home, he spotted something on a bus bench, a small black pocket notebook, left behind and forgotten. It was slightly scuffed, but the pages were clean. He picked it up, a simple object that suddenly felt like a solution. Back in his corner, by the dim glow of a distant streetlight, he found a half pencil in his pocket he'd picked up days earlier. He opened the notebook to the first page. His hand, calloused from demolition and now dishwashing, felt clumsy. He hesitated for a moment, then wrote his first entry, the letters careful and deliberate: construction painter. Brother-in-law of Maria, kitchen volunteer. Asks for Mr. Henderson, fair pay. It wasn't just a note, it was the first thread of a net. He didn't know it yet, but he had just laid the cornerstone of La Red. The small, grease-stained notebook was no longer just a passive repository of overheard chatter. It had become an extension of Carlos's senses. While his hands chopped onions or scrubbed pots in the steamy kitchen of St. Michael's, his mind was a filter, sifting through the murmurs of the dining hall for keywords: need, job, can fix, looking for. He began to ask quiet, unobtrusive questions. What kind of work did you do back home? He'd ask a man staring blankly into his soup. My sister needs help moving. Do you know anyone with a truck? A woman would lament, and Carlos would make a note. Woman in red sweater needs truck for moving Saturday. His entries grew more detailed. It wasn't just painting job at the fair, but county fair setup. Ask for a man named Stan at the East Gate, needs painters for stalls, pays cash daily. He drew tiny maps, jotted down bus routes, and listed names next to skills. The notebook was becoming a living document, a tapestry of needs and abilities woven from the threads of desperation and quiet hope that filled the church hall every afternoon. One Tuesday, a familiar face appeared in the meal line, looking more defeated than ever. It was Miguel, the man whose overheard conversation had first sparked Carlos's idea. His shoulders were slumped, the weary lines around his eyes etched deeper. Carlos's heart clenched with a pang of recognition. He watched as Miguel took his tray and found a solitary corner, eating with the mechanical movements of someone whose spirit had all but given out. This was it. This was the test. All the notes, all the listening, meant nothing if they stayed confined to the pages. Drying his hands on his apron, Carlos took a deep breath. His shyness was a physical barrier, a wall he had to consciously push through. He walked out of the kitchen and approached Miguel's table, the worn notebook clutched in his hand like a shield. Pardon, Carlos began softly in Spanish, not wanting to startle him. Disculpe la molestia. Miguel looked up, his eyes wary, expecting a request or a confrontation. I overheard you a while ago, Carlos said, his voice barely above a whisper. He flipped open the notebook to the page about the county fair. You were looking for work. Painting, right? Miguel's suspicion softened into weary curiosity. He nodded slowly. Carlos turned the notebook around and pointed to the entry. They are setting up for the county fair. They need painters. You have to go to the East Gate and ask for a man named Stan. They pay at the end of each day. He had confirmed the information yesterday with a man who had worked there for a day before his bad back acted up. Miguel stared at the neat, careful handwriting. He looked from the notebook to Carlos's earnest face. For a moment, he said nothing, the silence thick with unspoken doubt and a fragile flicker of hope. "Is this for real?" he asked, his voice rough with disuse. "It is," Carlos said, with a certainty that surprised even himself. "It's real." 3 days later, as Carlos was wiping down tables after the lunch rush, Miguel walked in. He wasn't in line for food. He stood taller, a smudge of white paint on his cheek and a light in his eyes that had been absent before. He walked directly to Carlos and held out a $20 bill. "I got the job," Miguel said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's good work. Stan is a fair man. This is for you." Carlos looked at the money, then back at Miguel's face. He shook his head, a genuine smile spreading across his lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. No, keep it. I'm glad it worked out. But how can I thank you? Just, if you hear of anything, anyone who needs help or anyone who can offer it, let me know," Carlos said, tapping his notebook. From across the hall, Elena, the volunteer who had first shown him kindness, watched the exchange with a curious smile. Later that day, as she helped Carlos put away supplies, a woman approached them tentatively. "Excuse me," the woman said, looking at Carlos. "Elena told me to ask you, are you the boy with the notebook? I heard you know things. My cousin is a good mechanic, and he's desperate for work." Carlos opened his notebook to a fresh page. The autumn chill began to seep into Los Angeles, a subtle shift that turned the early mornings crisp and the evenings cool. Inside St. Michael's, the warmth was more than just physical, it was the hum of community. Carlos's notebook was no longer a secret. Word had spread through the invisible channels of the needy and the hopeful, and the boy with the notebook became a fixture. Each day, more people approached him, their eyes holding a mixture of desperation and trust. His simple system was working, a steady rhythm of connecting a person to a task, a need to a solution. But one Tuesday, the rhythm broke. A woman named Maria, her face etched with a sleepless anxiety that Carlos knew all too well, approached him. She clutched the worn sleeve of a little girl's jacket, while a younger boy hid behind her legs. "I was told you help people find work," she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "Sometimes." "What kind of work are you looking for?" Carlos replied, opening his notebook with a now practiced confidence. He flipped through pages filled with his neat, dense script. Gardeners, painters, dishwashers, movers. Maria's eyes filled with tears. "Anything," she choked out. "My husband, he fell from a scaffold. He broke his leg. We haven't paid the rent in 2 months. The landlord, he gave us until Friday. We will be on the street, my children." Her voice cracked, and she couldn't continue. Carlos felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He looked down at his notebook, and for the first time, it felt completely inadequate. The jobs listed were for tomorrow, for next week. They offered daily wages, not the lump sum needed to stop an eviction. He could find Maria a job washing dishes, but it wouldn't save her family by Friday. The pages of names and numbers, once a source of immense pride, now seemed like a collection of useless facts against the sheer cliff face of Maria's problem. He saw the hope draining from her face as he silently flipped page after empty page. His network, his La Red, had a hole in it, and Maria's family was about to fall through. The weight of her trust was suffocating. He wasn't a savior. He was just a boy with a notebook, and his notebook had failed. Across the hall, he saw Father Michael moving through the crowd, offering a kind word here, a comforting hand on a shoulder there. He was an authority, a man of resources, a world away from Carlos's own precarious existence. An idea, terrifying and bold, sparked in his mind. He couldn't solve this, but maybe the network could. Maybe the network was more than just him. Taking a deep breath, Carlos closed the notebook. "Wait here," he told Maria, his voice firmer than he felt. He walked across the room, his heart pounding against his ribs. Each step felt like a mile. He intercepted the priest with a quiet, "Father, forgive me for bothering you." Father Michael turned, his expression open and questioning. "Carlos, it's no bother. What is it?" Carlos held up the notebook, not as a list of jobs but as a testament. I try to help people find work, he began, his voice shaking slightly. I write things down, but this is different. He quickly explained Maria's situation, the injury, the rent, the Friday deadline. He wasn't asking for himself. He was advocating, using the information he'd gathered to give a voice to someone who had lost hers. Father Michael listened intently, his gaze shifting from Carlos's earnest face to the desperate family across the room. He looked back at Carlos, and a slow, appreciative smile formed on his lips. He saw not just a boy, but an organizer, a leader. "You've done a good thing, Carlos, a very good thing," he said softly. "Our parish has a small emergency fund for situations exactly like this. Let's go talk to her together." The simple words were a lifeline. In that moment, La Red transformed. It was no longer just Carlos's notebook. It was a bridge, and it had just connected a desperate family to the heart of the community. The corner of the community hall at St. Michael's, once used for storing stacks of folding chairs, was now the official headquarters of La Red. It wasn't much, just a worn wooden desk, a slightly wobbly chair, and a large corkboard on the wall, but to Carlos, it was an empire. The faint scent of old hymnals and floor wax hung in the air, a comforting aroma that had replaced the stench of garbage from the alley he once called home. Father Michael had insisted on it after seeing the impact of saving the Flores family from eviction. "What you are doing, Carlos," the priest had said, his voice warm, "is the work of this church made manifest. It deserves a space to grow." The notebook, its pages now soft and frayed at the edges, still lay open on the desk, but it was no longer the sole repository of hope. The corkboard was a vibrant, chaotic tapestry of needs and offers. A hastily scribbled note in Spanish, "Si necesita pintor para un día, Glendale." Another in English, "Gardener wanted, weekend work, good pay." Tacked beside it was a photo of a smiling woman with a phone number, offering childcare in exchange for help with her English lessons. Carlos moved with a quiet efficiency that belied his age. He was the hub of a constantly spinning wheel. He picked up the receiver of the old telephone the church had provided. "Yes, Maria," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I understand. You can't take the cleaning job without someone to watch the children." He paused, scanning the board. His eyes landed on the photo of the smiling woman, Elena. "Hold on. I think I have someone. She lives just a few blocks from you." A few minutes later, two lives were intertwined, two problems solved with a single connection. He hung up, a small, satisfied smile touching his lips. He then saw Luis, a young man who had arrived in the city just last month, hovering nervously by the door. "The construction job starts tomorrow, but I don't have my own tools," Luis confessed, his gaze fixed on the floor. Carlos nodded, already flipping through a newer secondary notebook dedicated to resources beyond employment. "Miguel," he said, a spark of recognition in his eyes. "The painter. He finished a big job last week. I'm sure he'll lend you his tools if you're careful." He wrote down Miguel's number on a slip of paper. "Tell him Carlos sent you." Later that afternoon, as the low sun cast long shadows through the hall, Father Michael approached the desk, placing a steaming mug of coffee beside Carlos's elbow. He watched as Carlos patiently explained to a new arrival how the system worked, pointing to the board, his voice a mixture of authority and gentle encouragement. "You thought you were building a list of jobs," the priest said softly, once the man had walked away with a renewed sense of hope. Carlos looked up, his expression questioning. Father Michael smiled. "You were building a family, son. Right here." The words settled deep in Carlos's chest, filling the last hollow spaces left by his solitude. He looked around the hall. He saw Roberto Flores, the father he'd helped save from eviction, now talking with another man about a permanent position at his new workplace. He saw Maria and Elena sitting together, their children playing nearby. This was the empire his loneliness had forged, not one of wealth or power, but of connection, of shared burdens and celebrated victories. He was no longer the abandoned boy shivering in an alley. He was the heart of La Red, a quiet anchor in the swirling chaos of the city. And for the first time since he'd stepped off that bus, Carlos felt truly, completely home.